Hello and welcome. This is Jayanthi. One of the most profound aspects of our civilization is the conception of the sacred feminine, the worship and celebration of the divine feminine, and the willingness to see this divinity of Devi as all pervasive. Yet we're always presented with the claim that Hindu texts promote misogyny and that Hindu culture denies all agency to women, that we have goddesses, but Hindu women are seen as inferiors by the tradition. But what do Hindu texts actually reveal? It turns out that our texts are full of stories of remarkable women, women with agency, empowered women, strong women who lived life on their own terms, who braved the challenges of life with intelligence, wisdom, grace, and poise. They shaped not only their own destinies, but also that of their family, their society, and their civilization. Unfortunately, we now find their stories being erased and distorted in the popular imagination. To remedy this urgent issue, our guest today, Sri G.V. Shivakumar, has curated an anthology of Vedic women that includes the stories of 10 fascinating women. The stories here are retold in contemporary language while staying true to the spirit and the boundaries of our tradition, using Purushartha as a framework. Arya offers an Indic view of Vedic women, and in doing so, it challenges the narrative of the oppressed Hindu woman. Reading these stories raises the question: can an oppressive culture even allow for the imagination of such strong women? And could an oppressive society accept the presentation of such strong female characters? To discuss this and more, we welcome our guest, Sri G.B. Shivakumar, who works with computers when he's not curating books or writing them. Sri G.B. Shivakumar is a consulting editor at Indica Today, a scholar in residence at Indica, an organization that is dedicated to the preservation, protection, and promotion of Indic culture. Welcome, Shivakumar ji.
Namaste, Jayanti ji. Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be on the PGurus platform.
Yeah, it is a pleasure to have you here. Shivakumar ji, what inspired this anthology?
I think this is an important thing, and I never tire to narrate this. There are multiple things, so I'll begin with my personal necessity for this anthology, and then we'll go over certain other things that happened. As a kid, I grew up reading the story of Savitri. That was one of the first stories that I wrote and I read. And Savitri in the story is a strong woman, takes her own decisions, is learned, is divine, it makes her own choices, pushes back her father to make a choice, finally marries somebody knowing fully well he dies, and snatches that person from the jaws of death from Yama himself. So my own view of Savitri was that she was a glorious woman, a woman with who's completely empowered, and who is independent and fierce and knowledgeable, and so on and so forth. But this image, when I grew up, post college, I found that in the modern world is completely distorted. Rather, it's the other extreme. Sati Savitri has become a term for docile woman, subdued woman, and something that ought not to be, and so on and so forth. And this diametrically opposite view stunned me. And then over a period of time, I learned that this is not one instance. You know, Successively, even somebody like Draupadi has been portrayed as a subdued woman, and so on and so forth. Sita, who in Valmiki Ramayana is extraordinary, is also considered as docile, and so on and so forth. It is so I saw this over a few years. I learned that so in the modern narrative, this has gotten completely wrong. So it was always there in my mind that this ought to be corrected. So of course, many years passed by, and of course I found a lot of like-minded people, even though we were in a minority. that many of us wanted to change this narrative. And interestingly, in the Indian languages, this distortion is less. It's more in English and in the modern world. That also says a lot about what's happening in the world today.
Right.
So then my own journey with Indic Academy started 3, 4 years back, and we used to discuss a lot that this ought to be changed. And our head Harikiran Vadlamani, so he always says that he saw a series called Woman of Substance in the 80s and saw that Indian women were not represented and they ought to be represented. So one thing led to the other, and many authors who have written for this anthology, I know them, and they've also been talking about this in various other contexts. So finally, when Harikiran Garu announced that he proposes to publish anthologies and he wants themes and curators to come on board. So immediately I wrote that this is women of Bharatavarsha, and we should start from all the way from the Vedic era and come down till 1800, because it's important that if you go to this is not in just in our epics. We have fantastic women every century. If you just call out the very obvious names, you can get easily, you can make a list of 500 women very easily. I'll just give an instance. In the 11th century in Karnataka, there is an inscription of a lady. This inscription has very less words, and an image of a lady has been carved out. Her name is called out, called Savinirmidi, and she is described as Sarvashastra Prasiddhe, one who is versed in all Shastras. All can be whatever, that doesn't matter. But it is a set of Shastras that society considered as important, or a rhetoric for a lot of Shastras. And she is seated on a small stool or chair, whatever it is, reading a manuscript on her left hand, holding it on her left hand. And by the side, there is a stool which consists of a pile of manuscripts. Look at the imagination. And the society is celebrating her. A society that subdues women, will not celebrate such a thing. And if you come to the Rashtrakuta Chalukya era in Karnataka and in the Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh in subsequent years, so on and so forth, you will get Gupta era women. You will get innumerable number of instances. The records may not be written in hundreds of pages, but you will get very good descriptions of women in prominent position. Draupadi herself used to run the affairs, operations of the empire and the palace. So you will get this very crystal clear, you will get it. Kaikeyi used to, earn the tax revenue of a set of villages, and so on and so forth. In the imagination and in historical record, you will very clearly see until 1800, Jijabai, Ahalyabai, women who played a role in making this civilization. There is no charity to be given at all. They are they're equal makers of this civilization. So then this ought to be told. So we cannot become the generation that stopped the flow of the tradition and information and hand over a distorted narrative to the next generation. Obviously, I don't want to be part of that kind of a thing. So this compulsion within me was very strong. So when I made this proposal, Harigaru accepted, and then when we called for stories, we got 47 plus stories, which means people want this narrative to be changed. Even a 14-year-old had also submitted a story. It was quite fine, and in one of the future series we should take it through. And finally, the 10 authors who were, out of which, 4 or 5 of them I know quite well. They're all, part of our otherwise discussions where we want to change this narrative. So this is the book, Aryaa, an anthology of Vedic women. We named it Aryaa because, that is an ancient term starting from the Vedic era all the way till today. It has remained as a
Yeah.
word that represents nobility and high culture, and it exists in every other Indian language. So,
Right.
in Kannada it is Aryaa and Iyer, and even in Persian this word is there. In Southeast Asian languages this word is there in some form or the other.
Right.
And the authors of these, stories, Rohini Gupta, Manjula Tekal, Prasad Kulkarni, Bharati, Madhurima, Deepak, Rajini, Celia, Kavita, Ranjit, all of us, we share this, you know, this need, this sense. There is a sense of urgency along with the need that this must be, changed, and that's how we have this anthology.
Yeah. That was wonderful. I was actually just about to ask you why you named the book Arya, and the motivations, they just lay out crystal clear. Those women that you talked about, from Savitri, who was extremely learned, Draupadi, Sita, they were all very accomplished women, and they're being portrayed as submissive women who
There's
were,
not one woman in the epic who comes across as, not learned,
yeah,
submissive, helpless.
yes,
Very, very rare. Even in the most trying circumstances,
right,
they appear empowered with agency. They never, display a sense of resignation and helplessness. And that is our civilization.
yeah, yeah. So let's moving on to the book. The book opens with the story of Chitrangada, who is a
Yeah,
warrior and someone who always leads from the front and is in fact raised like a son. But eventually, she
yeah,
chooses the life of a warrior and decides not to accompany her husband, who was none
yeah,
other than the illustrious Arjuna. Instead, she
true.
chooses to stay and protect her ancestral kingdom, the kingdom of her father. Can you talk to us a little bit more about her?
Yeah, I think this story is written by Rohini Gupta. It's a fantastic reimagination. Uh, Chitrangada, you know, so once again, very few people know that her motivations for, staying back and, raising uh, Babruwahana. The story of Babruwahana itself is very popular, especially in various languages. You will see in Kannada there is a movie, full-fledged movie on Babruwahana himself, and it's the subject of very many plays. But Chitrangada herself comes and goes, in various locations, and hence, that part has been kind of it has in the context of Babruwahana's fantastic personality. Chitrangada goes to the background, but Rohini ji has done a great job in bringing out her character. Uh, what is important is that she thinks it is her responsibility. She assumes that responsibility, she assumes that agency. She thinks it is possible for her to make that contribution, possible for her to make that difference, to own and assume that responsibility, and that is important. And that is the and within the larger uh, sense of responsibility and dharma, what she thinks of her as her dharma, the beauty of her personality also comes out. And that is another aspect of the tradition, that if you look at, there are innumerable number of women portrayed, and our culture is not that culture which emphasizes on individuality, but every individual comes across as a different person, in a very natural sense.
Yeah,
Thus, Chitrangada also comes across as a completely different. She's charming, but she's not the kind of uh, uh, certain sensitivities are different in her. Because
yeah,
she wants to be a warrior, her personality is very different. And in this story, what interesting thing happens is that there's a slight transformation on Arjuna himself
yeah.
as a consequence of his engagement with, Chitrangada. Thus, it's not just a portrayal of Chitrangada as a person, it is also a portrayal of what impact she makes on people who come in touch with her, and that is the beauty that comes out in this in this story.
Yeah, yeah, and idea that she just decides to she recognizes that she has multiple dharmas and she chooses what she wants to do, and not just abandons everything.
Yeah, and
That
that doesn't cause trouble, and her
yes,
decision is respected, and she is able to execute it in the larger scheme of things.
yes, yes, and that's actually something we can talk about more. But that's something that comes up repeatedly, that these women they make certain choices and they're always respected. So, but I want to move on to the second story, which is, you know, extremely well known of Damayanti. She's an exceptionally intelligent woman. She's just undeterred by the slings and arrows of her outrageous fortune. She never gives up and she courageously wades through her destiny. So that's just courage and intelligence, just
And that
wonderful.
grace and poise in the midst of such trauma and such unpredictable situations. And
Yeah,
Damayanti, stands like she knows at the end of the day, she will wade through all this and reach her destination. There is a quiet sense of confidence in
right,
Damayanti. Not that she does express, you know, lots of fears
right,
intermittently, but the undercurrent is one of confidence.
right. And the other interesting thing is Damayanti, right from the start, she has a swam where she chooses her own, she chooses Nala, and then beyond that, even when Nala is in the forest, there's this idea that maybe he's never coming back, and maybe we need to organize another Swayamvar. And this is obviously, accepted by society at that point, that she has the right to remarry if her marriage just didn't work out or whatever. So, kind of a
Yes,
radical idea.
this point is often ignored.
Yeah,
When Damayanti announces her Swayamvara,
right,
you know, Rituparna does not express any concern because Rituparna knows Nala had married her, and
right,
you know he comes, which means the ground situation of that era was very different. Not just that, even Nala is only hurt and disappointed, but never says this is wrong.
yeah,
So, and Smritis themselves say that if a husband is abandoned and is not there, after a certain
right.
number of years, people would marry, and nobody made a big deal of it, and nobody knew in future, these things have demonstrated evidence is required in the future. So nobody thought of it. So nobody, but in these kind of instances, you will very clearly see that.
Yeah, I mean, it's mentioned casually. It's not mentioned as something that was radical.
Absolutely,
So, yeah,
absolutely. It was so
yeah,
natural.
yeah. And yes, and the next story, of course, is of Shakuntala, who we all know Shakuntala. It's one of the most well-known stories, but she's presented as often as a woman who was, just victimized. But there's another side to her, which is, I mean, of course, she was abandoned, but her courage in facing situation, how she raises her child, who turns out to be Bharata, who shapes our civilization, and how she goes to the court and challenges the king of Hastinapur. I mean, these are just very, unforgettable scenes, really. So,
Those are some of those extraordinary moments. And this episode is from Mahabharata. This
right,
version of Shakuntala's story is from Mahabharata, where Shakuntala is very fierce, very courageous, and she questions Dushyanta very strongly. And in this story, Bharata is already born when he was at the ashram of Kanyava's ashram. So she goes along with Bharata, who
right.
is Sarvadhamana at that time, and to the palace. Nobody questions. Kanva doesn't question.
Right.
and it's the Kalidasa's version which is slightly different. And Kalidasa's why Kalidasa has written that way is a totally different question that can be taken up. Even in
Right.
Kalidasa's different stories, there are very strong women. So it's not that Kalidasa was compelled to write it that way, but there is a Kavya reason for which why he has portrayed it that way, and
Right.
that truth belongs to only the Abhignana Shakuntala play. Whereas the
Right.
Mahabharata Shakuntala is a different thing, and that the world needs to know. The world needs to know that one, it needs to know what is the version in Mahabharata. Two, it needs to know how Shakuntala is portrayed as a very courageous lady. I mean, she can be all by herself, and she can do things, and she can and look at the way she shapes. She makes Bharata own up her own, his actions, and pushes
Right.
back him very gently, and she has that hold over Bharata.
Yeah. And, I mean, both Damayanti as well as Shakuntala, I mean, destiny throws multiple challenges at them. But it's not the fact that, Nala was, went away, or Shakuntala was abandoned. It's the fact as to how they responded to these challenges and how that's being portrayed that's more important to discuss. Yeah.
True.
And yeah, so it's not that they just gave up and someone else had to help. She does it all by herself, which is quite
Absolutely.
extraordinary.
And Damayanti does not seek anybody's, crutch.
Yes.
What she wants to do, she does, and she figures out a way. You know, it's a great combination of intuition and intelligence in the case of Damayanti. And
Yes.
she figures out every trick, and she has every trick in her basket to pull out and throw when the situation arises. And
Right.
finally, she knows Bahuka is Nala, and in many ways she is the hero of that story.
Right.
As my friend likes to say, she is the hero. She's the one who restores the kingdom back, just as Savitri restores the
Right.
kingdom back to Damatsena and Satyavana. Here it is Damayanti who restores the kingdom to Nala. And Nala knows it,
Right.
and Nala is very grateful.
Yeah.
And it's also important to know in each of these stories how men bow to the Shakti, bow to the
Yes.
greatest of women.
Yes.
Allah is so
Yes.
sensitive, so gentle,
Yeah.
and that needs to
Yes.
be,
Yes. Very respectful the whole time. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And the way they you know interact with women, that's really important as well. The next story, of course, is that of Subhadra, whom we all know and yet don't know very well. She's the wife of Arjuna,
Absolutely.
of Krishna, but we don't often think about the role she played in transitioning to a different era, how she oversaw the change that came about. And she recognized the importance of maintaining the continuity and being able to that the change wasn't necessary at the time, and then she recognized her role in making that happen in a responsible way. It was
Through this
just
story is written by Bharati.
yeah.
And so in this story, once again, Subhadra's story does not come in one place in Mahabharata. Like
Right.
many stories, many characters are kind of distributed across, the 18 Parvans.
Right.
And, the importance of Subhadra's character actually comes in the last parva.
Yeah.
It's one of those rare things. I mean, of course, when her entry is grand.
Yeah.
At least in the southern recension of Mahabharata, Subhadra who runs the chariot when Arjuna, when they go from Dwarka to Hastinapura and
Yeah.
Indraprastha. And while Arjuna is warding off all the warrior challenges, it is Subhadra who is navigating through the tough
Yes.
forests. So
Yeah.
that itself says that they were, trained and learned in some of those
Yes.
Kshatriya skills, all of them.
Yes.
So that is one. But subsequently, she comes and goes, and it is a series of gentle moments. But it is
Right.
in the final moment that the glory resides, and often not recognized. So in this story, Bharti has pitched it. What may have happened,
Yeah.
and it's a reconstruction based on lot of conversations, lot of re- possible conversations, but all those conversations reimagined based on how Subhadra was earlier and what her relationships with others were. So the lot of imagination is about reconstructing the existing relationships between two people and then
Right.
building over that. So that is how the
Right.
imagination is.
Yeah.
So it's one of those stories that brings out the enormity of a particular point in time, which actually
Yes.
was anchored by a woman.
Yes.
And it's she who passes the time or
Yeah.
enormity of an entire complex past flows
Yes.
through into the future through Subhadra.
Yes. Yes. That responsibility was left to her. The next story is of Madhavi, which who's that is probably one of the most unconventional stories. It is a woman who lived a very unconventional life and makes very unconventional choices. And
Yes.
even the story is presented in an unconventional structure. And it's
Yes.
so interesting. Yeah.
Extraordinary things require extraordinary structures, and Madhavi's story is one such written by Madhurima. So
Yeah.
before I move on, second story, Damayanti is written by Manjula Tekal, and
Yeah.
the third story is Shakuntala is written by Prasad Kulkarni.
Yes.
Manjula, of course, has published a novel and a couple of translations. Prasad is a new author.
Yeah.
Madhurima, who's written this story on Madhavi. This story is one of the most distorted stories already in the modern world in the 20th
Right.
century.
Right.
Bhishma Sahani has written a play on it in Hindi, starting which after which there is a series of distortions. So often it is portrayed as Madhavi as somebody who did not have any agency and who was
Right.
passed from one king to the other king and so on and so forth. In,
Right.
and if you read the original, if you
Right.
read Mahabharata shloka by shloka,
Right.
it is exactly the other way around.
Yeah.
It is she who demonstrates and presses her agency at each point in time. It is she
Right.
who is possessed with an extraordinary ability,
Yeah.
and every who marries her respects her.
Oh, yes.
Every son every son who is born finally looks at Madhavi like a Devi.
Right.
Finally, Madhavi, it's her tapashakti that restores Yayati, you know, to his
Yeah.
heavenly status.
Yeah.
So this it's a pity that this story, of course, it's on the one hand it is a pity, but on the other hand it is it can be imagined how easily one could distort this story if one did not have access to the original. Obviously, you can put out a narrative and that will stay forever.
Yes.
But
Yes.
thankfully now people have begun to read back the original,
Yeah.
and now it's this story fantastically puts across as to
Yeah.
how in a way it is it's a story of decolonization. I like to say that
Yeah.
we've all
Yeah. And
gone through journey.
yeah. Yeah.
We've
It
all
this
gone through. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say that this was one of the stories other than Chandali Duhita that I was not as familiar with, although I'd heard of Madhavi, but not knew. I mean, when I was waiting for the book to arrive, I actually was looking up Madhavi's character because I didn't know about as much about her. Almost everything was just terrible, like how she was used and things like that. But in what her actual story was quite different. And the other thing that, like you mentioned, she marries four men, but like she, in fact, she's pointed out as an example of Draupadi later on,
True.
and that's how I remember. Yeah, but that all the kings respected her, society respected her, her sons respected her, the sons, four sons who became four kings, and that was the destiny. She was destined to give birth to four kings, and they all saw her as being extremely virtuous, and she recognizes that this is her role for her atma in this jiva, and she um, you know fulfills it willingly and happily, and then chooses to be one with the forest. She
Yeah.
makes choices throughout, and she refuses a swayamvar, but the way it's presented often is really so
Yeah.
distorted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that really perturbs me is that it's one thing to criticize the tradition, but that
Yes.
criticism should be based on, some authenticity.
Yeah.
This both authenticity and integrity is lacking in modern criticism of the tradition.
Yeah.
There is a lot to criticize, which is fair, but
Yeah.
why can't it be based on the text, on what the
Yes.
text says? Why should it be
Yes.
based on convenient transformations that you have performed just in order to push one's ideology? So that is the
Yes.
disturbing part. That is
Yeah.
what we seek to correct. Put out the narrative that is according to the text.
Yeah.
After that, let's.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, just the fact that she was respected so much, despite the fact that they make a very big issue of the fact that she was married four times, had four husbands and four different sons. But that's not made an issue of, again with Draupadi, again with multiple people. And we find
Finally,
that
finally, Yayati offers his Swayamvara, which she rejects.
she rejects. Yeah. Yeah. No, I wanted to go to a point which is often not recognized. Like Draupadi is often, she's called one of the Panchakanyas, and
Yes, yes,
yeah, and it's wrongly interpreted as translated as Panchakanyas, five virgins, and as if, and again, this whole thing that we're obsessed with virginity. In fact, it's the entire,
true.
totally the opposite, because the
Opposite.
Panchakanyas are Ahalya, Kunti, Draupadi, Mandodari, and Tara, none of whom are virgins. In fact, most of them had been with more than one man, and yet they are revered and not
Absolutely.
spoken of as women of low character. In fact, they are considered women of very high character,
Very
spotless.
high character. Because of
Yeah.
the extraordinary tapascharya,
Yes.
in the midst of everything.
Yeah. It is not whether they were virgins, because the virginity doesn't even come in there. It's not even whether they had been with multiple men that mattered. What mattered is whether they were true to the dharma, whether they were honest, whether they were and how these women conducted themselves with so much integrity at all times. And
The
that
difference they made to situations around them through their tapascharya, and that
yes.
is that is the reason why they are occupying. Madhavi absolutely belongs there in the
Yes.
same at the same level.
Yes. Yeah, but it's just striking and telling that this was a society that decided to revere these women. Yeah.
True.
So, and how that is being so dishonestly presented today, as if they were five virgins. So someone just reading it without any context would be thinking that they're being venerated because they're virgins, but they were not. So anyway,
When
um
when we lose the narrative control, anything can happen, and that is
yes.
what is. You know, the objective of this anthology is to actually inspire many such anthologies.
Yes.
There is a lot of narrative that we need to reclaim, rightfully, justly, ethically, without any sense of politics, pure culturally. We need to reclaim a lot of narratives. So if there
Yeah.
are 1,000 people working on this, it's not very difficult.
Yeah.
It's just that, we just have to pick up where we have left and proceed further.
Yeah. So, moving on, the next story is that of Satyavati, who is just an unforgettable character. She's a fisherwoman who rose to rule an empire, and she was literally an Iron Maiden. She makes very bold decisions, and right from the start, actually, because in fact, when she is, um, you know, when Parashara Maharishi approaches her and tells her this is the right time to conceive an incredible um, child, she's willing to do that. And then she goes on to marry Shantanu, and then she faces the challenges of keeping the Kuru dynasty alive. So just faces very challenging situations. She doesn't phase. She is extremely bold. Something that just, I mean, it's just remarkable.
Yeah, it's remarkable. This story is written by Deepak MR, also a published novel. He's written a book on Abhimanyu. And this is one of the most extraordinary journeys in the sense that she starts as a fisherwoman and
Right,
comes to Hastinapura by chance. And but her life is once again made through the series of decisions that she takes.
right,
Although in Mahabharata, she's absolutely glorious from the beginning.
right,
The complexity that Bhishma faces and the dilemma that Bhishma faces sometimes kind of overshadows Satyavati's quiet navigation of this challenge. But finally, it's every decision, it's Satyavati who is making those
yeah,
decisions. You
right,
know, as Bhishma may be giving suggestions, but virtually it
right,
is Satyavati who rules the kingdom way until her children are able to, take care of themselves. And once again, when they die again, it is Satyavati who has to take those decisions,
yeah,
multiple decisions. And the beauty of Satyavati's character is in her conversations with people around her,
right,
conversations with Vyasa, her
yeah,
conversations with her daughters-in-law, and then with Bhishma, and then with others, and finally, when she leaves, what she speaks, that conversation with Vyasa, all this show her in fantastic light.
yeah,
So, if, for her, that necessity that once again, like Chitrangada, there is a parallel that
right,
she has ensured that the kingdom does not end, the lineage does not end. So there
yeah,
is this is another, you know uh, another very important aspect of our civilization is that the past must flow into the future through its natural course, through the present. So the
yeah,
ending of the past or the obstruction of the past is considered as a flow that is coming in, not as a state in the past.
right,
So it is sense of it's a flow of time. It's a
right,
natural flow. So Satyavati is very bothered that the natural flow of time, with respect to her lineage, is not ending. And that it's the same thing that Chitrangada also feels for
yeah,
her kingdom.
right,
So
right,
wherever such challenges are there, women have played a significant role.
yeah. Yeah, and they weren't afraid. I mean, the next character as well, Ulupi. She's a widow, uh, who basically falls in love with Arjuna, and then essentially kidnaps him, and finally proposes to him. I mean, she doesn't hesitate to go after what she wants, and she leads her life on her own terms.
She's
that's
not worried that Arjuna will wake up and kill her.
yeah. And but the point is also that again, they didn't it was socially accepted that a woman could remarry, and that she could basically propose to to the man. It's very different from what we're told, that you just at every step she's a woman with agency, and that's something that's lost on
And
us. So,
especially in Ulupi's case, she's quietly there somewhere, but she's constantly watching the center, what's
yeah,
happening, and then she makes some decisions that impact the center. So this, and she's quiet, she's confident, she's comfortable in her being in the periphery, but she
yeah,
knows that even while being in the periphery, she is able to make an impact on the center. And
right,
that confidence is important. In
yeah,
an era where everybody wants to be in the center all the time,
right,
this comfort in the distance is a big thing.
yeah, yeah,
She perceives a great beauty of life being in the periphery, and
right,
is not comparing with people who are in the center and imagining that their life may be better than hers. No, she's not at all.
yeah.
She's rather very confident about her position.
And that's
So
something
that
that's, yeah, throughout the Mahabharata and most of the stories, there's something that comes through as multiple people are willing to do things for the greater good, and that's something that's a recurring pattern.
yes,
Yeah,
and they aren't feeling that their life is better or worse than somebody else. That comparison is not there. That sense of Chitrangada is there in Manipura, and he's really not bothered about what's happening in
right.
Hastinapura, you know, and
Yeah,
it's- that's a big deal. And
right.
when you look at the description, the characters are fascinating everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. And the next two women I'd like to talk about are
This
Gargi and
story is written
Maitreyi.
by Rajini. Ulupi is written by Rajini, and
Yeah.
the beauty of this story is also that it is written in the what we call as Champu tradition. In
Mm,
Champu is a combination of prose and poetry,
mm,
and normally you don't find it in even in India. The Champu kavyas are very less in number.
mm,
After a certain point in time, it's pure poetry or pure prose. That's how it
mm.
has been. So, but this story is prose and poetry mixed, and that's another experiment
Yeah,
that has been done.
yeah, yeah. There's wonderful. Many of the stories, the structures that the way they've presented it is just as interesting as the stories themselves, adds to the beauty of the stories. Um, so the next two women, I want to discuss them together, Gargi and Maitreyi, because they're both just two um, very intelligent women. And Gargi is, of course, known for debating Yajnavalkya. Maitreyi is his wife. But they remind us that we had this very robust intellectual tradition among women. And even the Rig Veda, we have so many rishikas writing, so many verses. Um, it's something that is not discussed very much. The female contribution, intellectual contribution to our civilization is quite extensive actually. And apart from that, we had even Lopamudra, just tons and tons of rishikas,
Vada.
brahmachari.
So in the Rig Veda, in the 10th mandala, there is a sukta called Devi
Yeah.
Sukta, and it's also called Vak Sukta, I think.
Yes.
And in that, it is the mantra drashtarini is Vagambrini,
Yeah.
and in this, she describes herself as I'm I'm Rudra,
Yeah.
I'm Vasu, and it
Yes.
finally it says I'm Rashtri, I'm sovereign. The first reference to uh, Rashtra or a
Yeah.
form of the Rashtra is there in
Mm,
this sutra. And
mm.
there is this sense of, and so it's a sukta of that demonstrates the tattva of Shakti. And one of the
Yes.
tattva of Shakti is sovereign, in all by her own self.
Yes.
And that tattva comes throughout in all these characters. They all think they're by themselves.
Yeah.
Not that they're seeking, excessive individualism and isolation and conflict with
Yeah.
uh, things around them. They're
Right.
all by themselves, but also in harmony with everything else around them. And that is
Yes.
uh, and whether somebody is a warrior or a queen or a philosopher, it's the same confidence of being all by one's own self, but also in harmony with everything else.
Yes.
So
Yes.
in the story of Gargi brings out in her engagement with Yagyavalkya, she brings out the best of Yagyavalkya.
Yes.
That
Yes.
questioning is part of Yagyavalkya's, you know, coming up
Yeah.
with answers. It's his own discovery of knowledge also.
Yes.
It is in the conversation that the knowledge is also discovered.
Right.
And similarly,
Right.
in Maitreyi's case, it's it, Gargi unfortunately gets more attention in the modern world than Maitreyi, because
Yeah.
modern world is a little more biased towards intellectuality and you know and explicit narrative forms. Whereas in the
Yeah.
case of Maitreyi, it's a very complex role that she plays in shaping Yagnavalkya's journey. And
Yeah.
that story written by Kavita, that brings out that side. So on the one
Yes.
hand, Gargi's story written by Celia Pillai brings out how Gargi plays a role through her questioning, through her intellectuality, whereas in Maitreyi's case, that with story written by Kavitaji, there, the same role that she performs
Right.
by managing the ecosystem of Yagnavalkya.
Yeah.
So there are two different contributions.
Yes. 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 And but it's just wonderful that when we go to our just with the Rig Vedic verses or the Upanishads, we see these women right there, and that's something really inspiring. So, and that brings us to the last character, Chandali Duhita, who stood out for many reasons. One, I didn't know about her, and she's the one person I didn't know anything about. And also the narrative form, it was the whole thing is written as a poem. I mean, it's just beautiful. Just it was an
Yeah,
interesting
this
choice.
is written by Ranjit Radhakrishnan.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is one example from Mahabharata where the whole thing happens in a few shlokas.
Yes.
Okay. Like that, there are several women who
Yeah.
just come and go, you know. And if you just pull out those characters, another 20 stories will come from straight from Mahabharata itself.
Yeah.
Actually. So you can have two volumes, from Mahabharata itself.
Yes.
And once again, in this story, the beauty is that she is questioned and she thinks she has, and there's a seeming hurdle, and she is confident she will overcome that hurdle through by her own in her own ways. you know Once again, this is yet another case where no crutch is sought and there is no helplessness, there is
Right.
no lamentation. Narada comes and says you cannot, and she says we'll figure it out, and then she figures it out without violating the principle, but using her own tapas. And her
Right.
tapas ensures that, her husband also goes to the heavens along with her.
Yeah. Yeah,
Once
and
yet once confidence.
yeah, yeah, these are all just such amazing women, just amazing women who, accomplish just fantastic things, really. But we see that these stories have gotten distorted, and we wonder, how did we let this get this way in the first place? And one of the reasons, of course, is the colonialist lens that started during colonial times, and then post independence we've had various ideological frameworks that have continued to problematize everything about the culture. I mean, what do you think? I mean, how did we get here?
Yeah. So how did we, that's an important thing. This is what we need to reflect upon. Two things. One, we are not reading the original.
Yes, yes.
And why are we not reading the original? Because nobody is telling us to read the original. And why is all this happening? Because the education is not under our control. We have quietly left that to be badly curated over decades.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, yes, we slept. And I don't think this level of distortion was there even before 1947. It
Yeah.
is it is hard, to think, and it's quite dejecting to think that it is post 1947, in the free era of freedom, that we have lost it.
Yeah.
It's quite,
Well,
and we've let it happen through our own, by being naive, by being blind, by being lazy. We've let this happen.
yes,
That's the
yes.
one hand.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, if you are in touch with your mother tongue, Indian
Right.
languages, distortion is less.
Yes.
This distortion is higher in English because you have more resources written during the colonial era, which is passed on to the elite. Uh, and I mean, it's quite tragic to use the word elite in such a negative sense, but that is what it is. And if you are not in touch with your mother tongue, you will not have access to those resources, and the only resources in English are like this. And that is
Yes.
why this book, to say that in English also we need to bring back this kind of narratives from
Yes.
which are faithful to our accounts. So
Yes.
now whatever has happened. The good thing is that now there is a significant number of people who are going back and reading the texts all by themselves. The digital era has opened up access to texts in ways that we could not have imagined. As a
Right.
consequence, we are learning so many things that we otherwise did not know at all. And, publishers like Gita Press Gorakhpur have put out, uh, all these texts have always been available through Gita Press Gorakhpur, but that realization is a lot more there in the last 10 plus years.
Right.
And scholars like Dr. Vivek Debroy have put out the entire thing in English. And so now I think access has become better. Now it's our job to ensure that the future generations are compelled to go through the original accounts and then see things for themselves rather than being led by others. We definitely allowed ourselves to be led by
Yes.
completely wrong entities for the last 75 years.
Yes. I mean, we were asleep at the wheel, and I mean, the way
Other word.
to, yeah, if we are to reclaim this narrative, we absolutely need to create more indie content and occupy these spaces, really, and recognize that society is changing, and that um, you know we have to adapt to be able to tell our stories, to make room for this change. I mean, for one of the things that is true, though, is that the openness of our culture, it did suffer due to the violent
No
stress
doubt.
of Islamic invasions, and it's true that women were no longer as free, as what we see in Vedic times. because women were often the greatest victims of this sort of violence
No
that they
doubt.
experienced in medieval times. And then we see the appearance of Gungat and Sati in some parts, the disappearance of widows from public spaces, and so forth. But the point is that our texts do not support this. And we need to make that
And
clear.
wherever you can see that, wherever we lived with a relative sense of freedom,
Yes,
women in that region are different, and they've had the opportunity to contribute to the civilization differently. Take the
yes,
case of
yes,
old Mysore state, which did
yeah,
not suffer as much as other regions in India.
yes,
The most glorious era is 1900 to 1941, where fourth Krishnaraj Wadiyar was the king, and the whole state completely, it had the same kind of poverty as elsewhere, but it leapt into the modern world with great force, whereas other regions were left behind. But
yeah. He
then
was in.
when the king was young, it was his
Yes,
mother who took many decisions to
yes,
give land to Indian Institute of Science. The decision
yes,
was taken by King's mother, you know, and
yes,
she had the foresight to ensure that the child was educated in the best of the tradition and the modern world.
yes,
So where that freedom existed, where we were not quelled,
yes,
women had that agency and they exercised that agency, and that you will see through and through and through. The
yes,
Maratha regions were different, and you see Ahilyabai Holkar and Jijabai.
yes,
You know,
yes. And
so
actually,
you
the
can
point.
totally draw that contrast
Yeah,
completely.
the point that we need to bring forth is that our texts actually advocate for agency, and actually,
Absolutely.
when we look at, for instance, Ishwar, the Widow Remarriage Act that was passed in 1856, a lot of people think, oh, it's the British who passed the act, but in fact, it was Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who was a tremendous Sanskrit scholar, who argued that the widows not remarrying is against our
So
shastras,
he
and
quotes it from Parashara Smriti.
yes, and he talks about child marriage as not being supported. So he campaigned against these idea, you know, things, saying that this was not supported by our tradition. He put out these pamphlets. So there were people who were trying to diminish the Hindu tradition and try to blame all of this on the Hindu tradition. But Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, he said that we have to, look within the tradition to find ways to move out of what was,
Yeah, he was
you know,
a traditionalist in every sense of the word.
yes. And I think that's the model we need to look at, that we need to be able to look within the tradition to be able to resolve some of the social issues that do exist, rather than blindly copying a Western idea of an empowered woman, because the idea that we
Which
have
is not
actually
even
far.
empowering.
It isn't exactly. So when you look at these stories, that looks so shallow, it falls so short. But the way to do that is for us to occupy all these spaces, whether it's content creation or the discussions about women, discussions about everything, really, just environment, animals, anything. The more we leave these spaces vacant, the more we allow them to run away with the narrative. And by creating content like what you have done here with Arya, that is exactly what we need. So
I think there's a false sense of inferiority and guilt has, at least some of our previous generations, they were consumed by it. And the
yes,
greater you are only exposed to narratives in English, the more you are consumed by it. And time has come to, you know, cut through that false avarana, as we call it,
yeah, yeah,
and see things,
yes,
uh, in clarity. And we have the opportunity space to see things in clarity, and we must. I think now I see. I'm now I live in great hope now, because I see young generation, youth, reading these things. Lot more of them
yeah,
reading these things, talking about it. I think
yeah,
gradually will reclaim, but it's one such narrative. There are many narratives that need to be reclaimed.
yes,
Of course,
yeah,
we can't underestimate the battles that are, ahead of us, rather battles that have already come into the center of our conflicts,
Right.
because the kind of stuff, the five books written by Rajiv Malhotraji, with Vijaya Vishwanathan. They are talking about some of the most important battles that will come our way in the next 20 years.
Yeah.
At the same time, we now have enough number of people willing to stand up to things.
Yeah, and telling the stories like you have brought these stories, and we need stories in books as well as in movies. We need to occupy this the popular space in order to occupy the mind space, and that's one thing
Absolutely.
that our culture has always done, which is through music, through dance, through art, because dharma was transmitted through all the ways of through all parts of society,
Yeah. Yet
and
another way in which Telugu and Kannada cinema was lucky, because we did not suffer any distortion almost 35, 40 years in
yes.
cinema. You
Right.
know, we were producing narratives absolutely inconsistent with our tradition and past.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, in certain other languages, that thing has been lost. But you're right about that the visual media is extremely important.
Exactly.
If any gain that you have made, you can
Right.
lose it in a few years if you sleep.
Yes.
That much I have seen. That much I've
Yes.
seen that in 20 25 years, certain languages we have really lost it completely.
Yeah. 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 Well, thank you for taking this important step and reclaiming our stories and sharing your thoughts with us. Finally, I just want to end by saying that few cultures have utilized storytelling so masterfully, using stories as vehicles to embed philosophy, culture, ideas. Our ancient texts are so full of stories of fascinating women who continue to inspire us even to this day. Arya reacquaints us with these extraordinary women and makes these stories accessible to younger generations. It offers us a glimpse of the women who populated the imagination of this civilization for millennia, and it encourages you to discover the original text. So buy it, gift it, talk about it with friends and family. If you're a filmmaker or an aspiring filmmaker, make movies about these inspiring women of substance, not the candy floss representations that are all too common. So I just want to say that Arya is such an important book. It is the need of the hour. Thank you, Shivakumar for curating this much needed anthology. We really look forward to more such anthologies. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Jayanti ji. I would like to say that as long as, see, this was possible because Indic Academy and Harikiran Vadlamani Garu thought that this is important.
Yes.
So as long as we have institutions such as this,
Yeah.
many things will be possible. It also means that we have to come together and
Right.
work under institutions, build institutions, grow
Right.
institutions, grow people. And now
Right.
we have 10 authors in this, and these are published authors, and others are on their way to to publish their books. And they will tomorrow anchor such anthologies, and things will grow.
Absolutely.
So on the one hand, I can never be enough thankful to Indic Academy. On the
Yes.
other, it is important that all of us find such institutional umbrellas
Right.
and grow them deep, because finally it is that which will hold us in good stead.
Right.
As individuals, isolated individuals, whatever we can achieve is somewhat limited. But because there is Indic Academy, there is an author network, there is Indica books, there is Indica Today where I write regularly. We are able to
Right.
together achieve a lot. So it is
Right.
my humble submission to people that one has to grow both as an individual and as a contributor to institutions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Those are wonderful words. And with that, we end this. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time and really appreciate this first step. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dhanyavad. Thanks for this opportunities to be gurus.
Our pleasure. Thank you.